Hello, my name is Joy Francis. I am Executive Director of Words of Colour Productions from the UK, and welcome to New Narratives, New Structures, Fiction, a timely and critical conversation on diversity and inclusion in publishing in the UK and Australia. Part of the Stories We Tell Ourselves project, it's a partnership between Spread the Word and the Melbourne City of Literature Office. This event is hosted by the Wheeler Centre. In the wake of George Floyd's murder, the Black Lives Matter worldwide protests, and amid a pandemic that has exacerbated existing inequalities, what story are we going to hear about mainstream publishing today? Have publishers been inspired to make progress on inclusion and equity? How similar is the UK and Australian experience, particularly around the question of innovation? And what is the reality of being a First Nation and person of colour author at this transformational and challenging time? Joining me in this discussion are 6 people from different parts of the publishing landscape. So let me just run through, because there's 7 of us, 6 guests, and 1 hour. So firstly, I'd like to introduce Birmingham-born author, presenter, radio presenter that is, and campaigner Sharon Duggal, whose debut novel, The Handsworth Times, was the Morning Star's Fiction Book of the Year in 2016. And her second book, Should We Fall Behind, published by independent small press Blue Moose Books, was shortlisted for the Royal Society of Literature's 2021 Encore Award for Best Second Novel. Welcome, Sharon.
Yeah.
Multiple award-winning author, poet, essayist, and illustrator, Maxine Beneba Clark is an Australian-born writer of Black British parentage. She has written 10 books, 5 of which are children's books, and Maxine's Abia and India award-winning short fiction collection, Foreign Soil, is currently being adapted for television. Hi, and welcome.
Hi.
Okay, Dr. Radhiah Chowdhury is the Australian Publishers Association 2019 to 2020 Beatrice Davis Editorial Fellow, awarded for her research project, It's Hard to Be What You Can't See, Diversity Within Australian Publishing. Radhiah is also part of the publishing industry as a commissioning editor and audiobook producer at Penguin Random House. Welcome.
Hi.
Okay, Dr. Anamik Saha is a senior lecturer in the Department of Media, Communications and Cultural Studies at Goldsmiths University of London and co-author of Rethinking Diversity in Publishing, the UK's first academic study on diversity in trade fiction and publishing. His first book, Race and the Cultural Industries, was published in 2018, and his latest book, Race, Culture and Media, was published by Sage in 2021. Welcome, Anamik.
Hi, everyone.
Valerie Brandis is the founder and publishing director of Jacaranda Books, the award-winning independent publisher of adult fiction, non-fiction, YA and poetry. Founded in 2012, Valerie Brandis is the founder and publishing director of Jacaranda Books, the award-winning independent publisher of adult fiction, non-fiction, YA and poetry. Founded in 2020, the indie promotes inclusivity and diversity in the publishing industry. It has published 70 titles by a raft of talented authors, including multiple award-winning authors Irenis Okoji, Bernice L. McFadden, and Shola von Reinhold. Named Small Press of the Year 2020 at the British Book Awards. Jacaranda also published 20 Black British authors as part of the 2020 initiative. Welcome, Valerie.
Hello, everyone.
And last and not least, Robert Watkins, publishing director of Ultimo Press, has over 20 years experience in the Australian book industry, having worked in book retail, sales, marketing, publicity, publishing, and most recently as head of literary at Hachette, Australia, and has published books by a range of acclaimed contemporary authors, including Maxine, who's with us today. So welcome, Robert.
Hi.
So like I said before, 7 of us, 1 hour, a huge topic. obviously there's a lot to unpack in the time. So what I'd like to do is start with the research side, actually, with you, Anamik and Radhiah. You both produced research that focused on UK publishing, the UK publishing landscape, and both reports were published during the pandemic in the wake of George Floyd's murder on the 25th of May 2020. A year on, have your respective pieces of research made a dent in the publishing patterning in relation to inclusion? Radhiah, if I start with you. And that smile suggests an interesting response.
Thanks, Joy. I think the official position of the industry would be that the research was well received and was actioned. But I'll certainly say, in terms of being on the ground and in terms of seeing how the industry has moved on in the 18 months, we're coming on to 18 months since George Floyd's murder, that hasn't happened. There has been quite an urge to co-opt the research to try and sort of establish some bona fides, but the actual outcomes have not been achieved on any front. And I'm saying that as someone who works in-house at one of the big five, but also I'm the co-founder and one of the moderators of the Australian First Nations and People of Colour in Publishing Network, which is a professional network. And certainly the feedback from the 40 plus members that we have is that the different publishing houses and different publishing adjacent industries that they all work for, they haven't seen any positive change either. And it seems to sting a little bit more because at this point, the research exists, the conversation was started. So ignorance cannot be claimed any longer in terms of the excuse as to why that movement hasn't happened.
I want to, before I bring it on, I just want to draw attention to some of the findings, because both pieces of research, actually, we think of diversity in your research, mirror each other. From the gatekeepers being homogeneously white, Radhiah, Anamik, you say that despite publishers being invested in diversity in the UK, the industry undervalues minority audiences and still pursues the white middle class, reader as the ideal, and sees writers of colour as a commercial risk. So Anamik, yeah. So what impact? Same question really, but I just wanted to contextualise that a bit more.
I mean, it's what I'm about to say kind of might sound like I'm letting publishers off the hook, but actually that couldn't be further from the case. But these issues are entrenched. So, I had absolutely no anticipation that the findings that we produced, that we found, as you say, that publishers are basically, the whole industry is essentially set up to cater for one core audience, the white middle class audience, and that all other audiences are undervalued. Myself and my co-author, Dr. Sandra Van Lente, we didn't expect this to be fixed overnight, let alone within 5 years, for instance. But that is not to say, as I say, that publishers need to be let off the hook. And I think what was really interesting, I mean, when Black Lives Matter, the protest from 2020 happened, it was really striking how a lot of like media and cultural institutions who, ordinarily, historically have shied away from making any kind of political pronouncements, they all, kind of were very quick to release statements that showed their support for the movement, and publishers, the publishing houses, certainly in the UK, were the first to jump on that bandwagon. I just think if I could draw from some other research that we've been conducting recently, we did a survey of people from underrepresented communities, specifically racial and ethnic minoritized communities, who are trying to get in, who either work in creative and cultural industries or trying to get work. And only 17% of them in this survey of almost 1,000 people said that following Black Lives Matter and following these statements released by publishers in particular and other media organizations, felt that they had more opportunities. So this is obviously what has happened is that diversity is a huge issue, and I believe that our report and Radhiah's report kind of have helped keep that issue on the agenda, because there is a lot of fatigue around it, not least from the people on this, the esteemed people on this panel who, I can imagine are being asked to talk about these issues on a regular basis. So we've kind of helped keep, our reports, our respective reports have helped keep this on the agenda. What I find though is that there's this kind of moral need, publishers will articulate their desire to do better, but I still don't feel like they believe in the economic value, actually, of diversity, as much as they purport to. And that's because they still don't understand the non-white middle-class audience. So until you start changing, that that's hardwired into them. The whole industry is kind of, it's embedded in the very structure and the very kind of bureaucratic processes that publishers use in the making of books. And then until you start unwinding that, you're not really going to see much impact, which is why actually I'm really super interested in hearing the independent voices from independent publishers, because I think that's actually where the real radical change can emerge from.
Well, on the same trajectory there, Anamik, in terms of when I bring in Robert and Valerie, I think I want to pick up on your point, because Radhiah, amongst your recommendations, you talk about the fact that you feel the publishing industry needs to invest and not just invest in writers, but also in research. And what strikes me, it seems to be the case in Australia as well as with the UK, all the research on the publishing industry and what it needs to do has happened independently of the publishing industry and not with their money. So when you think about what you just said, Anamik, so Radhiah, I'll put it to you in terms of, so how on earth is that going to happen if you've seen, we've got, some progress in the UK, but the push is always from outside. And like you're inside and had to go outside to get funded to write about the industry you're in. Where are you at? I want you to respond to that, but also I'm curious about where you feel the Australian industry is at and the fact that you had to use the English model to make the case for what Australia has to do in terms of change.
Yeah, this is kind of a very, very big meta question about the Australian identity, and that is that Australia has never been comfortable talking about race on any level ever. So when we're talking about research on any front, there is a massive black hole at all times, pun intended, because we are on stolen First Nations land, and our national identity has not come to terms with that in any kind of meaningful way. And on top of that, the different waves of migration that come through, the sort of myth of the Australian multicultural dream is very much touted, but not experienced in reality, particularly by people of colour and by, minoritized groups. And so when we talk about race in Australia, we are coming from basically a negative space in terms of what data and research we have available to us, which was why the whole impulse of my research was to go and look overseas. Also because, the basic structure of the fellowship is that you go overseas to find out what you can and bring it back home. But even that is very indicative of the sort of tall poppy way that Australian culture thinks of itself. I knew that if I was going to do a survey in Australia, first of all, the data would be very limited because people wouldn't be willing to share it with me, if it even existed. But also, it's almost like if I can bring evidence that things are happening, however slowly, however glacially they're happening overseas, if I can bring even some evidence of that to Australia, it might have been some sort of a spur to try and do something similar here, although that has not at the moment been the case. And Anamik, I completely take your point that obviously this is a very slow movement, but I kind of feel like in Australia we've started moving backwards.
Anamik, I want to, it'd be interesting because obviously we've got, we're going to move on to independent publishing and speak to some authors as well. But what impact would you say? I'm in the UK, I was involved with the launch and everything else, I've worked with you, and I'm curious as to what you thought the impact has been. Where has there been progress? I don't want to make it all sound like doom and gloom. At the same time, we've got to speak, say things as they are, but where would you say progress has been made and where do you think it still needs to be made?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I'd like to broaden out for my report. I can't speak to the specific impact my report or our report has had. What I think is driving change actually are audiences, and that is and the demands of audiences, especially from those audiences who have been historically undervalued and marginalised in publishing. You know, we're in a world right now where, you know, public discourse is kind of dominated by talk of like culture wars and other, you know, and kind of, you know, wokeness and all this kind of thing. And basically what I think is happening, if we step back, what I think is really interesting is that the dominant culture, if you like, the culture who have historically run publishing industries and other media, you know, I think, I don't know if this is too bold a statement, but I think certainly in the history of modern publishing, I don't think that dominant culture has felt its authority under threat as it does right now. It's used to be calling the shots, deciding what is good art, what is good culture, what are good books, what books deserve to be made. And audiences now actually, and you know, for better or for worse, enabled by social media, are able to talk back directly to, if you like, the cultural gatekeepers in ways that they haven't been able to in the past. And this is having tremendous impact. What it's doing is it's causing tremendous anxiety amongst the core publishing industry, who all of a sudden are like, you know, panicking because they're worried that their books are going to use that horrible phrase, cancelled, or that they're losing, but more broadly, that they're losing their cultural legitimacy. And of course, losing the cultural legitimacy means that there's a danger there that's going to have an impact on their profit margins. So you've got this weird paradox right now in publishing, where on the one hand, they are eager to capitalize on diversity. They know they need to do better, not at least that's what audiences are demanding, but also they still undervalue audiences, particularly those like racial, ethnically minoritized groups. So they want to capitalize on diversity, but they don't know how to do it or reach those audiences. And you end up getting these kind of half-assed attempts to publish books by authors of color that, you know, there's a lot of fanfare about the signing of books by authors of color, but they're basically packaged in a way still that in order to appeal to the white middle classes. And so that leads to forms of exoticization or whitewashing, which was a common theme we found in our interviews. So that's the paradox, this feeling that diversity is there to be capitalized on, but they still undervalue particular audiences. And this is causing stress and anxiety, actually. And hence always talk about culture wars and so on. I think that's what's happening.
Thank you, Radhiah and Anamik. I'm going to come back to some of these points hopefully later on. There's so much more I want to ask you, but I want to bring in Valerie and Robert as independent publishers. And, you know, you both indie heads. It sounds like a musical tribute there, isn't it? Indie heads, but you know, and you've made it when we shortened the title indie rather than independent. But you've openly expressed your passion about, you know, the need for progressive, inclusive publishing, you know, and the fact, you know, that books broaden our worldview. I mean, Robert, you moved from a long career in mainstream publishing to heading up Ultimo a year ago. What does running an independent allow you to do that you couldn't do within mainstream publishing, particularly in relation to reflecting, having books and commissioning books that reflect the intersectional experience?
It's a big question, I guess.
Yes.
One year in, it's very, very early days. I still think for Ultimo to kind of be touting themselves as anything beyond a very small house that's published a handful of books. But the beauty of working at Ultimo under the auspices of Hardy Grant's funding is that we are operating editorially independently. And I do find that the conversations that we have in-house when it comes to talking about the books that we're acquiring is definitely more open and honest about how we see that publishing landscape evolving. But, you know, I was very fortunate also that when I was at a larger mainstream house in Australia, I was in a position where I did get to publish voices that were more inclusive than what they had been publishing previously. So I feel very fortunate that my mainstream experience has led to an even more fruitful, hopefully, independent experience. But I think Radhiah is right, though, that there's definitely like so much work still to be done, which is beyond what books we're publishing and into the workforces that are in those publishing houses as well. Like, the reality is that even with the independent publishers in Australia, those workforces are woefully underrepresented. So, you know, while there is definitely a real push to wanting to publish diversely, I think that there's a space particularly for those workforces. And I don't mean just editorially, I mean within our marketing and publicity and sales teams, for there to be a diverse workforce that are also championing whatever books those publishing houses are publishing. Because, you know, irregardless of what we publish, if it remains only the choice of the white people in the room what books are getting published in Australia, then we're not really seeing change at all. So there's still, I mean, like, we are still moving far too slowly.
Valerie, I'd like to say I don't know what you think, but I do know what you think on many of these points. And I mentioned about, you know, the 2020 initiative, you know, the first initiative of its kind. I mean, no mainstream publisher has ever published 20 Black British authors in 1 year. You've done that as an indie. You did that amid a pandemic. I mean, that speaks volumes. I mean, if you want to speak to that, and where that not just places you, but, you know, you've thrown down the gauntlet. And you've put 20 new different voices in the world. Some already published, some were new.
And I should say, you know, prior to that year, you know, I remember having a conversation with somebody who was very disparaging and was saying to me, well, who are you going to publish? Your brother, your sister, like, where are you going to find these people, essentially, was the sort of undertone of the comment. Now that we're post that year, a quarter of that list are now major prize award winners and long listed, and, you know, Polaris Prize, James Tate Black Award for Lote. I mean, prize winning books. So I just have to say that it wasn't just that we published these 20 authors, we did it to critical success as well. But I think, you know, thinking about what Anamik said about the publishing paradox, it's really frustrating for me many times to be a Jacaranda, because I think that there's obviously a need for us, and we're obviously doing what we're doing at a very high level, and we're sort of, you know, they say knocking it out of the park all the time. But I think for mainstream publishers, we could also present a little bit of a problem where they see us as maybe, I don't want to put it like just, you know, in sort of clumsily, but maybe they sort of see us as a bit of a dumping ground for where they, you know, if any Black author or any brown author that comes their way, oh, just go to Jacaranda, just go to Jacaranda. But bearing in mind, you know, we are an independent press. We are not funded by anyone, barely even funded by the Arts Council. When we did our deal with Hachette, there was not a financial component of that deal, which I believe, had I looked different, there might have been. I won't say there would have been, but, you know, I feel like it was quite, now, you know, further down the line, when I think of what we're trying to accomplish still, nearly 10 years in business, never had any funding from anyone. That kind of financial question and financial inclusion, it's a huge problem for us at Jacaranda, and we're expected to continue to keep knocking it out the park and to continue to keep discovering these voices that they just can't be bothered to, because as Anamik says, you know, they're not sure about the, you know, the economic question, or they're not sure whether they can do justice to the work, whatever the nonsense they come up with. But at the same time, I do feel that they know, the audience, we have it. We know we can capture audiences. We know when we do events, we literally get hundreds of people showing up. We know there's a demand. But if we're consistently underfunded as a press, there's no way that that's sustainable. And sometimes I wonder if that might be, you know, I don't want to get cynical either, but, you know, you sort of wonder, like, what do we have to do to sort of get that sort of level of financial inclusion? We've shown the critical, we've shown the cultural, we've shown the literary, we need the financial. I don't know if that's answering the question, but I'm really
you're answering.
Yeah.
many questions with that, because I think that the thing about it is still a competitive commercial landscape. So it's not, this is not necessarily a landscape that lends itself to generosity. So it's like, great, you're doing a great job. You're showing us where we're going wrong. Let's partner with you and let's invest in you. I think that it's a challenge. I mean,
they should, Joy. They should.
I'm not saying I'm saying that with such irony.
Yeah.
I'm saying that with such irony.
Yeah. Okay.
Because I'm just saying, because I think that if you're entrepreneurial, so I want to move on to the question of innovation. If you're entrepreneurial, you will be looking, and it's about problem solving. At the heart of enterprise and entrepreneurship in real terms is about problem solving. And if you are what you claim to be, you want to publish writers, new voices, transformational, they should be leading the way in terms of inclusion. And I want to come back to you, Robert, around innovation, because this whole thing around investment and what's come to light is the fact that, and is oft quoted, is that publishers are risk averse. And so that risk aversion is not necessarily going to lend itself to innovation, which is also what many publishers claim to be, and that they seem to fall short on that. And yet, as indies, especially during war seasons and during the pandemic, have excelled, particularly on online digital platforms and in reaching audiences. What partnerships? How do you see? What do you think mainstream publishers can learn from the indies, particularly in terms of innovation and collaborations? Because that's another thing. They work in silos, and partnerships are key, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, I think partnerships are key. I mean, in Australia, it's probably not exclusive to the independents doing some of that work, though. I have to admit, like some of the most impressive work in like looking for a more inclusive pathway for publishing here has actually kind of been championed both across indie and mainstream publishing. I mean, there's a relationship at the moment between Pantera Press, which is an independent press, and Liminal Magazine, which is for writers of colour, like that, like it's very specifically like a relationship between them to promote that work. And then there's Hachette works very closely with Black and White, which is a writing and editorial fellowship for both First Nations writers and editors, which I think, is an incredibly impressive work, and the team at Black and White are amazing. I think if anything, we could probably all learn something from Muggabella Books, which is an Aboriginal owned business and publishing house on the other side of Australia, over in Western Australia, who just do the most incredible work, but also kind of championing like fellowships for workers and fellowships for writers, and like the work that they do is so amazing. And I think in many ways, it's not exclusive necessarily to the indies in Australia, but I do think that some of those indies are doing some of that work, and it's kind of the work that I hope that Ultimo will do as well moving forward, because we're so early on, and I feel like the opportunities are out there, and we're going to have to seek those out as well. Like it's, I mean, I was very proud to have worked with Black and White when I was at Hachette, and I'd love for us to have those kind of partnerships as well. I guess the thing with indies too is, in the big publishing landscape here, often you have to be louder to get people to pay attention to the work that you're doing. So I guess if there's anything that is challenging for independence, it's to kind of make your work surface above that sort of sea of mainstream publishing that's out there. So I guess there's challenges as much as there is innovation for us to look at.
Thank you, Robert. And just before I move on to Maxine and Sharon, Valerie, I just want to, I mean, in the UK, a lot of, you're seeing a lot of imprints, isn't it? There's a history and legacy of imprints with mainstream publishers who don't seem to be doing what they need to do, but then they have an imprint where all the inclusivity resides. And a model that I suppose breaks through that is dialogue books, for example. That's part of Hachette that's come up a lot today. But what I want to ask you is, because obviously publishing is part of a quite complex, ecosystem, and a pipeline is usually a huge issue in relation to writers, getting their work published. And so, but you've also spoken about booksellers, calling them the new gatekeepers, really, because the attempts to get titles on the shelves is usually an exercise in futility. Do you want to say a bit more about that?
Well, it hasn't changed. Even with our new sales and distribution situation, it's still a struggle. I think there are opportunities there for small presses, especially if you have quite a clear ethos, where we're really focusing on our online and digital sales and marketing, and really trying, and that is a little bit more of a level playing field. So you can directly reach your consumers and directly speak to people and generate your sales and have more control. So we're definitely looking to really support that within our business as well. But yeah, I think booksellers, especially in the UK, have an inordinate amount of power. They sort of sit quite quietly within the ecosystem, because we always go on about the publisher, big houses and independent presses, but we don't actually think about the artery, which is, the vein artery network that is the book selling world in this country. And they're the ones who will decide whether the book goes on the shelf or not, and it's just that simple. And oftentimes these are, if you think about it, we think about big sort of urban situations when it comes to book selling. So we think about London and the Waterstones, and we think about all the big cities, but actually I think there's something like 279 independent bookshops around the country, might be even be a little bit more. And they're often in very small areas, very sort of local areas. And they have an enormous amount of influence amongst, in the little culture of those communities. And so if you can't penetrate into those little areas where there's no reason why somebody living there wouldn't want to read a book set in Ghana and London, or set in, Lagos, there's no reason why they wouldn't want to. But if they're not even seeing that book in the first place, then it's a disaster. And oftentimes it is who you're selling to and just the personality type. They're not diverse, the sellers, either. So there's just layer upon layer upon layer of challenges to overcome. But I do think that, to go to the positive side of things, we've seen a lot of success just through our own endeavors within our Shopify and our e-commerce. And, it kind of feels like, back in the day when the rappers used to sell their music out the back of their cars, it kind of feels like that's what we're trying to do in a very high-tech way. But it actually works. It's been working for us.
Thank you, Valerie. I want to bring in Maxine and Sharon now as two writers. Maxine, based in Australia, and Sharon in the UK. And what strikes me, I can imagine loads of things you want to respond to from what you've heard. And I want you to, I think in a way, I want you to put you in a position where you can cherry pick. But one something that strikes me is that, and just from watching you, Maxine, and reading about it on, for example, your TED talk about your journey as a writer, and Sharon reading your piece on your journey as a writer. There's a lot of similarities between you. But it seems to me that, to be a writer, a Black writer, a writer of color, you have to be so many things before you put pen to paper. You have to be an activist. You have to generate your own audiences. And it's almost like it is an inherent sort of, you have to develop this sort of, gene where you, whether you like it or not, you're dealing with politics in your work. Because you're working within a particular landscape, even to the point when your book's out, who's going to review it? That's another part of the ecosystem. So and publishers say, we want to, publish writers, and yet that appears to be a struggle in particular quarters. And they say they want great struggles, and yet here we are. Still talking about the importance of representation. Maxine, your journey, from slam poetry, and when you say, which enabled you to circumvent the gatekeepers directly to reach your audience. What a starting point. To now where your work is being taught in schools, and in your own state where you grew up, and the fact that yet your daughter, foray or journey into children's writing was because you didn't see your daughter being represented. So, I mean, what would you say is the reality for authors of colour in Australia, considering that you are a successful writer? I mean, you know, because you could be used as a poster person for, look, this is how good we are.
Yeah, I think
I know there's a lot there. But yeah. I know there's a lot.
I think your comment that when you're a writer of colour in Australia, you have to be everything. You know, I guess that's my comment to people who say, well, you did it. Why can't someone else do it? You know, it's like I write poetry, I write memoir, I write kids' books, I visit schools, my work is on the syllabus. And, you know, I'm still just making ends meet, you know. So I think, you know, that's the expectation, not even the expectation, but the amount of work you need to do as an author to get your work to an audience. And the reality is in Australia, it's very difficult to make a living or even close to a living if white audiences are not reading your work. You know, so it's, you know, I know people of color are reading my work because I'm always getting feedback and they're Instagramming it. But the reality is that it also needs to be read essentially by, you know, the mass, which when it comes to something like literary fiction is tertiary educated, you know, white women over the age of 30, really. And so how do you do that, you know, particularly when you're writing on heavily political subjects, you know, my first short fiction collection, Foreign Soil, mostly African diaspora characters, you know, it's set in Jamaica, in London, in, you know, the deep American South, in Uganda, you know, so many different places. And I think, you know, so my journey was I performed spoken word. I had my poetry picked up by a very small Australian press. By very small, I mean one guy in his back shed. And, you know, that was my first 3 poetry collections were published that way. And then I wrote this short fiction collection, Foreign Soil, which I tried for 2.5 years to get published, to no avail, and then it won an unpublished manuscript award. And all of a sudden, all of those hesitations, all of those things I'd been told about, who's going to read this, you know, how are we going to sell it, there's no audience for this, just disappeared. And it was kind of like, take your pick of publishers. And the fact that it needed that stamp of an award, you know, it was the same work that I'd been shopping around for 2.5 years that's now on the syllabus. But had that award not happened, I'm still convinced it would be under my bed. And so I do think it is that perception, you know, as you've all talked about, that this will be difficult to market and it'll be difficult to sell and no one's going to be interested, instead of just looking at the work the same way you would look at, you know, if you can sell a book about wizards, you know, why can't you sell a book about African diaspora people? Yeah, so I think, you know, I essentially had, you know, after a lot of hard work, a stroke of absolute luck that the right people were on a judging panel and they were all Anglo-Australians, but had backgrounds in hybrid works or short fiction or, you know, things that really made them look at my work very differently.
Thank you for unpacking my question in such an eloquent way. Maxine, I want to come to Sharon, because a similar thing, Sharon, isn't it, in terms of you operate in so many different spaces. You're a broadcaster, you're in literature development, you write books, you mentor other writers, and you're a campaigner, you know, and you went through that process of, you know, multiple rejections. And it appears to me that, you know, at the moment, yes, we're celebrating Bernardine and so on, but a lot of the writers that are coming through, and I know that Valerie, some of the writers on her roster are 40 and above, you know, and having the careers, you know, later. So, you know, yeah, same question to you really, in terms of juggling all these hats and yet trying to find the space to just write and just be a writer, and what the challenge is.
Oh my God, it's like, you know, it's huge actually, because all those spaces, you know, a lot of them are passions and I want to be doing them. Actually, I just want to be sitting in the room writing books, and I want to be writing the books I want to write. And, you know, there's so much around it. And my first novel, which came out in 2016. It's a very similar story to Maxine, like you said, Joy, you know, multiple rejections. And I'd just about given up, you know, I had young kids, I was, you know, working a lot, you know, doing a paid job. And then a little bit was published in a report, which was a report about the lack of diversity in publishing, and I had a little, you know, it was an open submission, I had a little bit in there, and a publisher saw it and contacted me. And he, you know, they were a small independent publisher. You know, I don't think it would have been picked up by any bigger publisher for lots of reasons. And a lot of people did say, well, you know, who wants to read a book about a British Asian family? And specifically, who wants to read a book about a British Asian family in working class Birmingham in the 1980s? You know, which is, yes, it's intersectional, but there's a lot of stuff around class, I think, as well, which we haven't really mentioned. And I think there is, you know, what I found with that book was, because it was about these communities that I'm very intrinsically part of, these inner city communities, as well as the kind of migrant, immigrant communities of my family, that there was an extra wall, you know, this extra wall of class. It's almost like an acceptable face of multiculturalism, which is the face that comes through Oxbridge or, you know, public schools. And I don't think that has changed. I think there's a bit of shift, thankfully, from my first book to my second book, but I still think there's a big issue around what kind of writers of colour are getting through. And I'm finding with my second book that this is mostly because there's still a lot of who you know, and I know more people now because I'm further down the journey. And so I'm kind of seeing that world in a different way. But, you know, it's complicated and complex and many layered, as we all know. So I think that there are these extra gates that are being kept, us waiting for these doors to be opened in different ways. So, and I think the indies are doing a fantastic job. They're doing all that development work, taking all that risk in the UK, and it sounds like in Australia as well. And, you know, my publisher does that too. But I don't know where the real change is in those bigger publishers, kind of seeing it from with my literature development hat on and my, you know, as well as my writer hat on, where those real structural changes are happening. There's some great initiatives, but I'm skeptical about how long-term they are, what real impact they will have, unless, you know, there's these indies doing all this foundational work and then these big guys come in and swoop in and pick them up. And so there's all of that, and there's this sort of idea of what your this kind of almost burden of representation in a way, you know, what you're who you're representing in your writing, you know, as well as this sort of who the publishing industry are representing. And I think there's complications about that because, you know, I want to write about these communities that I've grown up in and I'm part of, and they're not specifically Indian diaspora communities. They are very mixed communities. So there's that extra layer as well, which, you know, and it's not so much the case with me, although it might be with my third book, but I know writers who are on their fifth or sixth book. You know, there's one, you know, it's a Black writer, and he said no one wants to publish his fifth book because it's not Black enough. You know, there's not enough race issues in it, he's been told. So there's this thing that Anamik said about capital, you know, capitalism, I suppose. And that's, you know, I think it comes down to that. If there's money in us, you know, then we're interesting. But I've only just got an agent after my second book because I was just not attractive to an agent. But now there's a bit of a sellable package. I am a bit of a commodity for a third book, so I'm quite skeptical about my agent, who's hopefully she's not watching, but you know, about that. But yeah,
Well,
sorry, I've gone on a bit. But
no. But there is a lot, and I mean, you know, the whole thing about your cultural capital at this moment in time, you know, and it should be more than a moment. And I want to go back, Maxine, to a point you made about promotion, and that, you know, the veneer, what it looks like, because you're prolific, you know, you're hardworking, and you're incredibly creative, and you're an illustrator as well. You know, illustrating your own children's books, and at the same time, though. And it's funny what you're saying about promotion, because ultimately now the digital platforms, and this is coming back to the question of innovation, you should be known globally. You know, I mean, I know that they're, even through doing this discussion, I was sort of knew of you, but I'm even, you know, now I've had to delve a bit deeper. It's like half your books I want to get, you know, for different people. And I just think there is a whole thing around promotion, and how you navigate and negotiate that, because it's not just, to be honest, I wanted to sort of come back to a point around, you know, you need more white people to buy your books to make money. I mean, there's a lots of diaspora communities in different countries that would love to read your book, and your books will help them make the case in their countries. So what then needs to happen for that connection to be made? Do you see what I mean? And what needs to shift in terms of how writers are promoted, because they usually promote the big one. That's where the marketing budget goes.
Yeah, I think there's an interesting thing. It's interesting that you bring up the international issue, because, you know, you don't think, or publishers, audiences don't tend to think of an Anglo writer as being part of a diaspora at all. You know, when I'm published, I noticed, you know, in my latest kids book, when we say Black Lives Matter, you know, in the US, I kind of looked on the inside jacket of the book, and it says, you know, Maxine Beneba Clarke is an Afro-Caribbean slam poet. And, you know, yes, that is, you know, my dad was born in Jamaica, my mum was born in Guyana, they both grew up in London, you know, I'm kind of global, but obviously that's easier than saying I'm an Australian writer of Afro-Caribbean heritage. Mm-hmm. And similarly, when my work is published in the UK, it's kind of, you know, she's of Black British parentage, because like, it's just too difficult for people to go, this is a book about Black Lives Matter written by a Black person who's Australian, but not Indigenous. And I think that is part of it, that breaking through internationally, it's not just being published in our own territories. It's, you know, and when I talk about white audiences in Australia, you know, the Afro-Caribbean population in Australia might be 0.5%, if that, of the country. And so, you know, we're really, even when we're talking about African diaspora, you know, we're talking about maybe 2.9% of the population. And so, yeah, there really is that sense of, well, I want to get my work to African diaspora people, but it's those gatekeepers making the decisions about, you know, how we're going to market this person. And, you know, I know when I tried to get my memoir published in the US, they kind of said, well, we've got so many memoirs about African-American writers. So who wants to read a memoir about a Black writer growing up in Australia experiencing racism? You know? And so, yeah, it's that sense of every place you try and publish, or every place you try and have your voice heard, these new and unique challenges turn up that are not even, you know, not even necessarily. I remember when I published Foreign Soil was published in the US, it came back with this list of, you know, it's maybe 2 A4 pages of Australian terms. You know, we call a case of beer a slab of beer. So they'd say, you know, what's a slab of beer? And what do you mean when you say my old man? You know, someone referring to their father. All these kind of really Australianisms in the writing. It was like, wow, okay. So it's not even my Blackness in the States, it's also my Australianness. So yeah, just so many complications. And I feel like, you know, a quarter of my job is finding ways to contort myself into convincing people that no, this is still marketable and it's still saleable. And probably I'm only just at the stage in my career now where the body of work speaks to that, you know.
Talk about, thank you, Maxine. Sharon, just quickly bring you in here before I sort of widen it out, the discussion a bit more. Along that continuum, reviewing, getting your books reviewed, you know, we've had a range of different pieces of research there'd be poetry critics and so on around the lack of diverse reviewers, for example, just in poetry and across the board in terms of literature is this huge issue. And, you know, how are people going to know about your books unless you're interviewed, unless your books are reviewed? I mean, how, you know, you're working on your third book. How have you found that? Because you know the literature landscape and the media landscape, but how tricky has that been? And then when that happens, you know, do you put your hands to your head in despair like Leonie Ross did recently for One Sky Day? Some of the reviews of her books and interviews has just driven her a bit, you know, to a point of despair. Yeah.
Well, I mean, yeah, I mean, I was lucky with, well, we keep saying lucky, but actually we've just had to work bloody hard at it, is what it is. So with my second book, Should We Fall Behind, I did get some national reviews in The Guardian and the TLS, but I had to do a lot of work to get those, you know. I had to do loads of research. My publisher doesn't have a big publicity, or doesn't have any publicity departments. I'm sure Valerie understands that kind of thing. You know, there's not a huge amount of money there for that kind of thing. So, you know, I had to do all that research, do all these spreadsheets, build these kind of contact lists. And I had to pay with my Arts Council grant a friend who was a publicist, a marketing in a completely different area. I said, look, just be the front, you know, we'll write the press release together. You just send it out because it's a bit bad if I send out a press release about myself. And then I followed it up with personal emails to these reviewers saying, look, you know, you keep saying you're going to review books by different kind, you know, you're going to kind of diversify what you're doing here. And two of them did come back and they did review it, which was great. And I was very pleased with those reviews. But I know that is completely, you know, it's such a rare thing to get those kinds of reviews. And I think more importantly, you know, there were book bloggers who I think are doing a lot of this work now. And there are kind of the, you know, the Eastern Eye newspaper and these kind of, you know, press aimed at community groups. So yes, you know, you get fed up of being asked the same things, or particularly getting asked why you think you can write about certain things, or why you're presenting your community in certain ways. You know, there was, I do remember with the first book, somebody asking me about whether I can't remember the exact words, but, you know, there's an alcoholic Punjabi father, which is not a rarity. And I think that's, I think that, you know, that probably goes back to some of the kind of post-war migration traumas, that wave of immigration experience, but also goes back to, you know, a lot of other stuff, probably around colonialism and the degradations of that. And part of, you know, I think there's reasons for this, but, you know, I got, you know, somebody said, oh, it's a bit, you know, you're exposing your dirty, you know, our dirty laundry, and we shouldn't talk about these things publicly. You know, so there's, I can't even remember what your question was, Joy. I'm sorry.
No, it's about reviewing. You answered the question. You answered the question. It was around, you know, the challenge of, it's no point writing a book. You publish, you write a book, and then how are the audience going to know about it? And the fact that in terms of reviewers being predominantly white, but you've answered. I'd say you've answered the question. You've definitely
publicity, is very, very hard to come by, and. Yeah, we just want to be getting on with our writing, you know, we don't want to be thinking about all this stuff. You know, I'd quite like to hand it over to a big publicity machine, but I'd also be quite worried about that as well, about covers and things.
So I want to just throw into the mix, because I think we've got about 7 minutes or so left. I'll wait for something to pop up in the chat to correct me. But one thing that underpins all of this, isn't it, is the emotional labour that is expended for this, on top of your, you know, the same thing applies, isn't it, Valerie? Your publisher, publishing director, you nurture your writers, you know, you curate, you don't just acquire, but there is the always, you have to keep bringing that centrally. But yeah, about the emotional labour on both sides, you know, Radhiah, you know, you've researched your own industry and you come, you know, you're doing the job, you know, and then you've got to go home and unpack all that and try and live, you know, your life, you know, so if anyone wants to speak to that, you know, before I ask the final question, really.
I mean, I would love to.
Yeah. Radhiah.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's one of those things that is very much the elephant in the room. And Valerie, you mentioned this when it turns out, you know, in terms of financial investment, in terms of capital, as Anamik, you said, you know, when it comes to our presence in the market, clearly we have an audience. Clearly there is a need for what we do, but we have to be we being, you know, people of colour, we have to be the driving force behind everything all the time. You know, an author with Maxine's bona fides still has to do the amount of work that you have to do to keep yourself in the public consciousness, you know. You know, when we're talking about those partnerships, Robert, that you mentioned with, you know, Liminal and Pantera and, you know, all these others, you know, little independent, I shouldn't say little, they're huge in terms of their presence. But, you know, Liminal drives that particular program with Pantera. Black and White do the bulk of the labour before Hachette come in. Magabala operates completely separately to everybody and doesn't interact with anyone else in the industry for a very specific reason, because then they have control over everything that they do. So, you know, the labour is coming from us, and then, you know, a publisher might swoop in and try to capitalise off that. But then, you know, an author of colour will be asked, can you find us the other audiences who might like your book? For example, can you do the extra publicity? Can you let me know what, you know, what community publications there are who might want to review your book? And then the flip side of all that is, when all of that labour maybe doesn't get the results that a commercial publisher really wants, then the fault and the blame comes back on the POC as well. So, you know, it is very Sisyphean in the sense that you're sort of pushing that ball, and we do it because we love it, and we do it because we believe in it. But the actual investment of time, of resources, and of the generosity that you mentioned, Joy, you know, plenty of white authors get to be mid-list and have a crap third book and they still get the fourth deal. But we have to be everything to everyone all the time, or the doors close.
And for me, as a publisher, sorry, just real quickly, that is a real, like, heart space hurt, because that means all of the risk is mine. I have to find the money to keep on offering authors 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 book deals. That has to come from somewhere, and we do market and we do publicize, and we really want to do a lot for our authors. So I hear it all, and then still there's that, you know, at the end of the day, the buck stops here as well. You know, we're not being supported as a small press, I believe, the way that we should be, in order to continue to facilitate what we're doing within this industry, which is history making, culture changing, all the rest of it, you know. So anyway, that's it.
Anyone else? Maxine?
Yeah, I think for me, the bulk of that emotional baggage comes from the weight of the potential failure. You know, that I know that if this book doesn't sell, the next person from my background who comes along will have that much harder a job getting their work published. And so I think it's not even the sense that, oh, you know, this doesn't fail, I can always try something else. You really have that sense. And you know, I've had friends on the flip side, you know, I've had friends who've said, look, I've tried to get this book published, and publishers have said, well, Maxine Beneba Clark's already doing that. You know, this sense that there's one of you, so that's fine. Yeah. You know, already got one of that flavor kind of thing. Yeah. And so that dual thing of how do you make space for other people, you know, which kind of, you know, some of the anthology projects that I've worked on, like the book Growing Up African in Australia, have kind of tried to find those other voices and elevate them. But also, yeah, how do I, you know, that weight of well, you're not just doing it for yourself, you're doing it for the writers before you and the writers beside you, which I feel is not a weight that a lot of other writers necessarily have.
So true.
I'd just like to add to that. Yeah, sorry.
So go on, Sharon.
I was just going to add just very quickly to what Maxine said. And I think when you first introduced me, you said I was mentoring and campaigning, but you know, we do a lot of this background work to try and pull others up, but it is exhausting. You know, it's really tiring. We'll keep doing it, you know, because we want to make sure there is real sustainable change. And yeah, but it's tiring.
Anamik and Robert, a response to that? Yeah.
If it's okay, Robert, I can come in quickly and just say, yeah, one of the things that it's been fascinating to hear everyone speak today, and it really kind of illustrates a kind of a core finding from our research, and that's, you know, people from minoritized groups, they don't have the same creative freedoms as their white middle class counterparts, but they also don't have the same freedom to fail. It seems to be kind of what's coming out of this conversation right now. And I think Sharon mentioned the burden of representation. You know, I remember this one author, an Asian author, who kind of basically just lamented the fact that he can't write shit science fiction, was how he put it. He just wished he wanted the privilege to be able to write shit science fiction, and which I think kind of sums up the kind of predicament that people from minoritized communities, whether that's along race, gender, disability, so on and so forth. And I think, you know, I guess the only thing I just want to kind of say is that I think in terms of, it's about how we can bring people into book culture, people from marginalized communities into book culture, whether that's writers, readers, and people into the industry itself. At the moment, it is a closed shop, essentially. And there's been amazing people, not least the people in this panel, who have been kind of able to make interventions, really important and meaningful interventions. And it's the cases, how, you know, the challenge is, how can we prise open the cracks that the people in this room have kind of, you know, made. And I do wonder about, you know, we've talked, there's been a few allusions to the C word of capitalism, but, you know, I wonder if we need to think of a new mode of production. To what extent, you know, will all of you benefit from, all the practitioners in this room, you know, would benefit from funding to help level the playing field, essentially, because people are, you know, people who are staking out as independent authors, publishers, booksellers, but people in publicity, and so, you know, this entire ecosystem needs to be transformed. And to what extent can it be transformed with the system we have right now, which is based around profit-making imperatives? Or to what extent do we need the state to recognize the, you know, oppression that it's helped enact, to take responsibility for that, and actually, you know, subsidize and support people from minoritized groups who are trying to, you know, make meaningful culture, make meaningful forms of culture for the good of the nation, you know, for the good. So yeah, that's the only thing I'd say.
Robert, I'll pass that last point over to you now, because you know, there is so much, again, in terms of your commitment, but then you've been aware of what your authors of colour go through, and the fact that you're going to have to go that extra mile and be in rooms where, you know, there is no one of colour, things are said, and you have to, you know, disrupt and intervene that narrative. That is also an extra pressure. So again, yeah, just hand over to you in relation to all of that as well.
I mean, I definitely don't draw any equivalence between my experience and what it must be like to be a creative of colour working in this space by any stretch. You know, I can only admire the work that you do in that space, because I can't imagine what that is like, because it's obviously not my experience. But I guess I can just hope to continue to play a role, at least as a proper ally, hopefully by uplifting those voices rather than platforming my own, or I mean, like, even being on this panel feels like a platforming of a voice that, you know, probably doesn't deserve the space and time at this point. Like, it, you know, like, it really does feel like I wish there was a publishing director of colour in Australia that could be on this panel speaking to this. Like, I do wish that that was the case. So, you know, like, I think there's definitely still work to do, and I just wish it was happening faster.
Right, I think that's my cue then to actually end here reluctantly. I'd like to thank Anamik, Radhiah, Robert, Valerie, Maxine, and Sharon for your time, for your candor, and your experiences today. And I just want to end on just a quote from Alex Wheatle, award-winning British author in the UK, and please look out for this award-winning Quantum Light series, who said, you know, publishers now need to invest in the value of Black writing and writing of colour, and publishers need to understand the value of Black narratives. So all I can say on the back of the research that's been done, who you all are in your respective spaces, that actually lands in a way that takes root. So thank you all, and thanks to those who've stuck with us and listened to this really, really important and critical conversation. Goodbye, everyone.